Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
I can.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, good morning. My name is Ade, or Ade Shokade Bomi. I'm a fifth year, and my capstone project was around the evolution of soccer in Africa. What I mainly focused on was going through the years and from basically the late 19th century up until date, how it's grown over the years. So, okay. So what am I going to be discussing? So the things I discovered were centered around the origin of soccer and how it was introduced to Africa, um, the roles that retired and active players have played in getting the sport to grow over the years, um, the roles FIFA and CAF have also played in the growth and development of soccer in Africa, the role FIFA World Cup in 2010, which was hosted in Africa, has played, and also the government initiatives and the national football federations in these various countries and what they've done to help the sport go to the position it is at now today. So what's the origin of soccer? There are many different variations to soccer in the world. I mean, the most popular one was formed by the British in about 1863, and that's the one we follow today. It was established when the English FA was founded, and English FA meaning the English Football Association, and with the Scottish Football Association, um, Irish Football Association, and the Welsh Football Association, they created IFAB, which is International Federation of International Football Association Board. And it was created just to manage all the rules and regulations that follow soccer. And that was when that actual sport was established. So soccer is also known as a beautiful game. The history traces back to many different generations and um, periods in time. There was a version of it in China and Greece. The Romans also had theirs, and yeah, it was basically the foundation of the modern day game, the beautiful game, was from the British. And the picture you can see on the side is the Ghanaian soccer team of national team. And back then they didn't really have opportunities to play. And the trophies you can see are from the games they had with other African countries where they competed with them. And that shoot was for a game they had against Real Madrid, which was a very big game. So that game was a match between Ghana and Real Madrid in Accra. And Real Madrid is a Spanish club, probably the most prestigious and biggest club in the world when it comes to soccer. They've won the most European competitions, and that year they were the reigning champions of Europe. And they were able to host a game with Ghana, which was really big for Africa. And the game ended up 3-3, and it basically solidified the fact that Africa was very serious with soccer and they were there to stay. And so how was soccer in fact introduced to Africa? So the most basic way of putting it was through colonization. So based off what we know, the English, the Portuguese, the French colonized a lot of the parts, if not all parts of Africa. And through these means missionaries, military, and traders who plied their trade in Africa and moved over from their European countries um, brought the game with them. So in their free time, they took to playing games on the streets, hosted actual matches, basically showed what soccer was to the locals of Africa. And from time to time, the game continued developing and was picked up by the locals. One thing that made the sport easier to pick up compared to other sports was the ease to which a game could be scheduled. So everyone needed to play a game of soccer was really something that he could kick around that would be good enough as a ball, something that he would use as a goal to put the ball in and count as a point, and basically people to play. So not a lot of rules were required, and because of that, it was easy for people to pick it up from day to day. Initially, Africans were merely spectators because it was dominated by the white folks that came over from Europe, and because of that, um, it wasn't easy initially for them to be recognized. They had most of the African clubs that were created initially were white only and were only available in the 1880s and the 1890s. But in the early 1900s, the Cape Coast Excelsior was a Ghanaian soccer club that was created that allowed players to be from African countries and were locals. And so because of that, the players and people of the country began getting more invested in the sports. With that, as countries as colonization began to get phased out, the World Football Organization, which is FIFA, the Federation of Football in the world, began to recognize countries, and that was one way for the African countries to be recognized around the world as an actual entity outside of the colony that they were initially based off of colonization. So who else played a role in this? So African players or retired players that plied their trade in Europe. Europe is technically basically the foundation of soccer. So we're the most high level and best soccer in essence is being played. And with African players plying their trade over there, it inspired the younger generation now. Some of these players like George Weah, who won the Ballon d'Or in 1995. The Ballon d'Or is the most prestigious trophy an actual player can win. He won that in 1995 and inspired a lot of generations. The 2002 World Cup in Brazil, I believe, also inspired a number of generations, like a player like Sadio Mane, who was a 10-year-old at that time. Because of seeing his country, Senegal, making it up to the quarterfinals, which is the furthest an African country had ever gone, inspired him to go on a 7-hour-long bus journey, which took over 250 miles to get picked up by a soccer team. And right now he's playing in Liverpool, one of the most prestigious clubs in England. Stories like these are the few that have inspired the younger generations in Africa to continue to strive and find a way out through soccer. The person you can see on your right, his name is Nwankwo. He is a Nigerian national that played for Arsenal and a number of other African countries, African European teams. After his career ended, he created a heart foundation back home in Africa to help with people that had heart defects, as during his career, he suffered through a heart defect and had to overcome that to come back to play. And because of that, with the money he made and the career he was able to create for himself, he was able to come back and help those who didn't have the opportunities that he did. Aside from that, he also started his own international football academy to bring scouts from Europe closer to Africa to help them find younger talents and propel the sport in Africa to another level. So what roles that FIFA and CAF played? So FIFA, the Federation International Football Association, is the world governing body of football. No place or team or anything can basically be surviving or revered if FIFA does not approve of them. So the fact that as time went on over the years, as the different footballing federations were created and getting approved by FIFA, it gave Africa some standing in the world, meaning that they were being recognized for the football that they played. Another governing body, which is the Confederation Africaine de Football, is the administrative body for African soccer and basically control all of the soccer played in Africa. So they govern the Confederation of Africa and they are recognized by FIFA, and they host two major events, which is the CAF Champions League, which is their rendition of the UEFA Champions League, and it's a competition for clubs in Africa and the best clubs in Africa to compete to win the trophy. They also have the African Cup of Nations, which is a competition for the best football in African countries at the current moment, competing to win the trophy. And these two events really just give scouts and other and clubs around the world an access to see the different talents that are available in Africa and outside of Africa, and basically shows the talents that are available and gives people that might not really have a chance before these competitions a chance to get picked up by some countries, some clubs outside of the country and do better. So another thing that helped soccer grow in Africa was the 2010 World Cup. It was the first ever World Cup hosted in Africa. It was memorable for a number of things, including the popular songs Waving Flag and Waka Waka, and the Vuvuzelas, which was very, very popular around the world during that time. It led to the construction and renovation of 10 world-class stadiums in South Africa. And with that, the resources were made available afterwards to the younger generation and people that live in the country as of now. And that really helped the infrastructure and for soccer to grow in the local leagues, as before then, a lot of these stadiums weren't up to par with the best or world-class stadiums that could be found in Europe. But with the funding that went into building these stadiums and making them as good for the World Cup, it really helped the country grow. This was also the first time that we had 6 African countries in a single World Cup tournament. Typically, initially there was only one shared by Oceania, Asia, and Africa in the late 1900s. But as time went on and as the sport grew and African countries continued to succeed, as well as the growth of the World Cup, it eventually grew up to 5. And so 5 countries were allowed from Africa to compete at the World Cup. But this time, because South Africa was a host, they had the world record 6 countries at the time. The successful completion of this World Cup led to the creation of a legacy trust fund by FIFA. And its goal was to continue the development of South African soccer. Since then, $18 million had been raised since 2013 to help with the betterment of the sport in South Africa. This money has been used to grow the women's sport. It has been used to grow beach soccer and indoor soccer. It's been used to build the local footballing associations, which basically were tasked with creating smaller leagues for the grassroots under 17, under 15, and under 13 kids, so that soccer is introduced as early as possible to these kids and the talents can be tapped into as early as possible. We've also had the government's initiatives, which have been used to help the sport grow. Most of the governments provide funding, and they do this through the national footballing federations of the different leagues. So as you can see on the right, we have the South African Soccer Federation logo, and right underneath that is the Premier Soccer League, which is the soccer league known for South Africa. And the same for Nigeria, where we have the Nigerian Footballing Association, and then right underneath is the professional league for soccer players. What these federations do is they manage soccer from the highest level to the lowest level in the country, and are tasked with maintaining the quality and improving it so that the country is always competitive around the world. This is done by introducing sports as early as to the grassroots, working with different businesses or scouts from other countries to come work in Africa for a time period or in that country for a time period to help train these players, potentially give them a pathway to make it to Europe and go apply their trade at one of the best places in the world. It's also tasked with, as you can see, the different soccer leagues in these countries, and basically handles making sure that the quality can be as improved and constantly growing up as much as possible. With this, these football federations have been able to plan friendly games against some of the best countries in the world, plan friendly games against soccer teams in the world, just to give the game more light in the country and help it grow as it could. Oops. So, are there any questions?
Thank you, Adi. I really enjoyed that. I don't know. I'm a big soccer fan, but I don't know a whole lot of the history of soccer in Africa. I know when we first talked about your project, I probably mentioned various things in my own past related to soccer. And you know, when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s and watched English soccer, there were no black players at all. And gradually over the course of time, you know, a lot of teams now, I'm not sure that I've ever seen a team with a majority of black players for any particular game, but certainly there are a lot more black players in England, both local, people who were born in England and people who were born in Africa. In any case, one question that I have, particularly because Nigeria has always been at the forefront of African soccer, that I know. I wonder to what extent the advent and the growing popularity of soccer in Africa, has that interacted with, a lot of African nations have civil wars, and my understanding is that they're often tribally based. I don't know if they're always tribally based, but how is the popularity of soccer interacted with tribalism in countries, particularly, for example, in Nigeria? Again, when in the 60s, there was a huge civil war in Nigeria, and I wonder if soccer is helping to develop national cohesion, so that the people from different tribes in particular countries now recognize themselves as Nigerians as opposed to their tribal origin. Have you thought about that at all?
Yeah. So one thing I do know is, because Nigeria or most African countries aren't known for having like the best governance or people empowered maintaining them. One thing most of the politicians have used is the national games, because they know how much people love the game. It's really been used to appease the people. They've hosted some of the best friendly games. I know a couple years ago there was a match where they brought Atletico Madrid from Spain over to Nigeria to play a friendly game with the Nigerians. And during the periods of elections, a lot of times they use the most popular soccer players to get endorsements. So one thing people know back home is the fact that the game is loved by everyone. And once you get on the soccer pitch, more often than not, whatever tribe you're from, whatever place you're from, it never really comes up at all during the game. You just enjoy yourself and have fun with other people. And that's one thing that has always brought Nigerians together. When you play, from when I remember, you don't ever think of, oh, this person's from a different tribe. We're all like the World Cup, we're all Nigerians during that one period of time where we're all celebrating and hoping that our country goes far together. And that's one thing soccer has done. It has brought the people together and always has. And I think it will always continue to do that, because there's just a love for the game that's inexplicable, that is shared by everyone. And no matter like the differences that we have, backgrounds, there's something about the game that we all love. And it seems like it just continues, and doesn't really, tribalism or any of that stuff doesn't come into the forefront when the game is involved more often than not.
Okay, thanks. That's good to know. I have one other question. In Europe, every country, no matter how small, some little principalities in the Pyrenees between Spain and France, for example, they have a national soccer team.
Mm-hmm.
And is it the case in Africa that every country now has a national soccer team? Has the sport developed to that point where every country now has a national soccer team?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe as of right now, there are about 50 something countries in Africa. And last time I checked, I think it was the same amount that were in the Confederation of African Football. So I believe every single country in Africa right now has a national football team. Now their players might not be the best, or they might not have the best exploits, but I think every single country as of right now has a national team and plays the game to some level.
Okay, all right. I really loved your presentation, and now I'm going to hand it over to Meg. If you have any questions, Meg.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Ade, I really enjoyed that presentation. I really appreciated learning the origins of soccer in Africa. And actually, my first question, which you already answered, was going to be, despite its origins, the way in which it was, it originated, and some of the negativity and racism, it seems like a real unifier.
Yeah, I would say, so initially, because of the way it was introduced, it might have like a bad light on it, but over time, because Africans or the locals were allowed to eventually get into the game. The few times that they were able to play their white counterparts, it gave them an opportunity during that time period to feel like they weren't like subordinates to them and they were more on the same level. So certain wins in certain games went a long way with them because, I mean, it's different when someone comes to your territory and then basically like, I want to say bosses you around, but controls it. But when you have the chance to play with them and even mix with them and play on the same team, it went a long way. And I think that's one thing that soccer did. Like just reading up on stuff, most African countries at that time knew that they couldn't match up with like their English or European counterparts with like education, technology, and other things. But with stuff like soccer, where all you need is a ball and you can try your best to like level the playing field, that was something that really helped them. And that was one of the reasons why the game with Real Madrid actually did happen, because Ghana had won a number of games in Africa and they wanted to compete against the best of the best, which was in Europe. So the chance for them to play that type of game and not lose was really helpful to the natives of Africa. And so yeah.
That's great. But I liked your phrase, leveling the playing field. It sounds like literally that's what they had an opportunity to do. So my other question is about the poster, the graphic that you showed for the World Cup in 2010. Could you explain to me, does it look as though someone in the background is carrying a gun?
Do not know how to go back on this. Oops.
I just was curious if you could walk me through the graphic there and the rationale for it.
Okay, I'm not the most experienced. I think I was 11 years old.
Populates. Yeah, I can tell you the slide once it populates here.
Yeah, this one.
Right.
Yeah, actually, I don't know the rationale behind that. I didn't even notice that before.
It looks like it looks like a machine gun.
Yeah, it does look like a gun, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I was curious about maybe what else was happening at the time, or if it was, a representation of, the country's challenges.
Yeah.
And hosting this event.
Thinking about it. Yeah, maybe I think. Yeah, I mean, the background looks like the map of Africa, and then it looks like someone running away. And it looks like the balls. Yeah, I think there might have been maybe a civil war or unrest in the continent at the time, and the soccer ball on Africa looks to bring everyone together for that time period, just to celebrate and not worry about what was going on. Maybe that's what the rationale behind that was. I'm not entirely sure. I'm actually gonna go check and see after this what exactly was the reason behind that.
I think that's a really good inference. But to learn what it is, then please include that in one of your papers. Because we'd be interested. I really enjoyed that. Really nice job. Thank you.
Thank you.
So normally we would open it up, but I think in the interest of time, we're going to go right to Truc. And thank you very much, Adi. It was a great presentation. And Truc, you're up.
Thank you.
All right, I'm ready. All right, can everyone see the PowerPoint?
Yep.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Truc. I work with my mentor, Kim, who helped me with the research paper and the presentation. The reason I picked this topic is because my goal is to become a teacher someday, specifically to deaf children. I really enjoy learning more about deaf children's experience, how they're approaching or learning language, and that perspective. So today I have a list of how we're going to proceed, how I learned the different ways or different ways to work with deaf children. And I did some more research analysis as well. So for my introduction, I want to talk about how if we look at what's important for access to deaf children, it varies quite a lot, especially with language. There isn't always a universal access to language, or it's not always provided to deaf children. Some children grow up learning more how to speak. Some children are taught more by their parents. Some children are skilled signers. It varies quite a lot. It also can depend on their level of education, which can vary as well. So it's not always a standard language for many of these students. And from the research we found, it provided that most deaf students are born to hearing families. And so because of that, they don't always have access to the sign language. And the research showed that it's quite a small percent that's actually deaf children born to deaf families. So because they're born in hearing families, not a lot of them have that early exposure to sign language. I'll go more in depth with more of that research later. I did a lit review on the perspective of teaching deaf children. And again, most parents that have a deaf child are hearing, and so they don't know how to communicate originally with their child. So there are various ways language can be provided. It can be within an environment, for example, where the parents are very focused on teaching the deaf children, teaching them how to speak, teaching them various language, and they grow up and become quite skilled at speaking. Or if a parent isn't sure what to do, they could maybe take a child to get a cochlear implant, speech therapy. But often if that child struggles and it's unsuccessful, then they're not often offered access to both signed and spoken language. When a parent has a deaf child, usually they try to send them to, there's two types of schooling they can send them to, what we call mainstream or a deaf school. And those experiences are quite varied as far as what the students learn. To give you a little bit more background from the research about deaf students' differences in their education, it's hard because for the deaf students, there's a lot of language, there's a lot of speech therapy involved. Sometimes the language is sign and they're quite skilled at it, which means that the parents maybe have decided to provide that option to their deaf student to expose them to more than one language. As I already explained before, when a student is mainstreamed into a school, there's usually, the deaf children don't always have an interpreter. So it's usually that they're dependent on speech. Usually they have a good foundation, hopefully built at home, of using their speech growing up. But if a deaf child is not taught how to speak or is not taught that sort of language, putting them in a mainstream situation is not always successful. We've noticed too that through the research that deaf students who are mainstreamed with an interpreter still have a hard time with education or with the professor, even though there's an interpreter there. The reason usually stems from depending on where they grow up, what their environment is at home. If they're exposed to a lot of things during their mainstream school, they wouldn't be exposed to otherwise. So their language acquisition is important in that aspect. It can really help with knowing the background of the deaf children, how they grew up. And it's really wise to use a teaching method that matches that student. And as we know, students vary greatly. So now I want to focus on the two different languages and how we can compare their use of them. I know that there's the difference between speech and signed language, but we're just going to kind of focus on what can help a deaf person be successful. Sometimes it's speech plus sign. Sometimes a student speech doesn't work for them at all. Teaching them to speak doesn't fit. It depends on the student. So this research helped us learn how to recognize within the deaf student if the child is not working or using speech is not successful for them. And then to come up with different strategies or different methods to teach that child. If speech is working for that child and that's what they prefer, we still have to know who they are and what their differences are, what their benefits are to learning speech. It's important that they have access to sign language because it can also help visually with them as well. And it gives them that extra benefit. Even though they could be very skilled at speech and sign language, I don't want to put one above the other because sometimes speech is not offered as a full access to deaf students. So for example, in a mainstream situation, if they're depending on speech alone, and maybe the professor doesn't have a clear voice, and they'll have to ask the kid next to them, hey, what did the teacher say? Which means they're missing some content while they're asking their friend, and that is not full access. So we want to provide whatever language is most successful to that student and whatever way they learn, whatever is their foundation language is best. So this was pretty impressive. A lot of analyzing all this research, through all of that, we found evidence and we interviewed 6 different people, all from New York State. Some are very successful backgrounds, some are well experienced for deaf education. And now we're sort of looking at the aspect of being an expert at sign language versus speech. So through my interviews, there were some deaf people who said they have experience growing up within their school education. And then most were kindergarten through 12, kindergarten, middle school, high school, but it varied quite a lot. Some were in mainstream, some were at deaf schools, a little bit all over the place. Most of the time it seemed that deaf students may start in a mainstream school and then transfer to a deaf school at some point, maybe around high school, but they tend to go into a deaf school eventually. So one thing we noticed that it really varied as far as language uses. There were many people who were exposed to a language because of their family. One interview I did, someone told me that they grew up very oral, meaning they were speaking. And she said she's pretty good and expert at English and speaking because her parents really taught her well and laid that foundation. Some of the people I interviewed said their parents did not teach them any kind of sign language, speech, nothing. They used a little bit of what we would call home signs, meaning sort of signs they made up at home. And so when they went into school, they struggled a lot at a mainstream school because they didn't have a good foundation of any language. Those students ended up going to a deaf school where they had to learn the foundation of the language first before they could really start picking up the education. Students who had a good foundation in whatever language first tended to do well in a mainstream situation because they already had that foundation. And so therefore their education was more successful. Deaf students often struggle the most in education as far as the English goes. It's always English is the sticking point. There's usually just not enough information when you actively teach someone English. Even if a teacher is like you're in an English class to learn English, there are so many things that a deaf person misses or doesn't have access to. Some deaf people are quite skilled at speech and English and maybe lip reading, but there are still frustrations involved with that. There's never going to be 100%. There's no one who knows it exactly perfectly well. When we see and compare oral students to signing students, there's a big gap. There's a difference between the students who sign and the students who speak. That really helped me understand where that acquisition of language is important. It's not about, I'm not saying one way is positive and one way is negative. What I'm saying is access to the language is what's important. Having the visual cues is important. So based on that research and a lot of the interviews I did, everyone seemed pretty happy with what they've learned, their experience based on their backgrounds, where they grew up. We also saw that a lot of research proved that the 30 to 40% of deaf students really struggle with lip reading. It's not always successful. More often, it's a complete knowledge of the language is what is successful. One reason that lip reading is not the best for communication is because there's so much missed when it's just lip reading. We need more, they need more than that for access. So now for me, I'm trying to think about how I would provide deaf children, how I would provide success to deaf children. Would I need to bring in an interpreter, maybe captioning, different things, technology that will provide the support and access that those students need. And as a teacher, I want to try to be creative in how I teach the students. I believe professors need to maybe sit down with the family and have a discussion about what that student needs, what's their background, what's their experience, how did they grow up, what did they learn, do they use sign language at home? So having that conversation with the family is important because the family is that, I mean, it's that student's connection. They're going to see and be around their family more than I will be as their teacher. And as a teacher, I have no idea who this student is coming in. I don't know their background, what they've learned so far. I need someone to sit down with me and tell me what the student needs, what their background is. And I think that would allow me to be much more creative in my teaching aspect. And I think that would allow more students to be successful and have better access to the language. Whether they're skilled at lip reading or not, or just use sign language, it's still about that access to help those students be successful. Most deaf children go to school and that's really their second home, right? Going to school is like second home, and you want it to feel that way. You want to feel connected. You have friends, you can easily communicate, whether it's an ASL or speech, with your teacher, with your friends. That's really important to the deaf community overall. And I think that we have to do a lot more in-depth research into backgrounds and where students get this knowledge and understanding. And can we teach them to be more successful with this? And again, understanding that not all students think or learn the same, and how we help with those students means we have more knowledge, more creativity, more models to show those students to have them be more successful. I want to have as much resources as I can and be as creative as I can to help those students. I always want to try to be more creative, as much creative as possible, to help those students learn and get the access they need. All right, that's it for me. Does anyone have any questions?
I will, but Meg, why don't you go first? I think it's your turn to go first.
Okay, thanks. That was really interesting, Truc. It sounds to me like your interviews were really invaluable in providing good data for you to utilize. I guess my question is, based on the data that you also used in the presentation, I'm wondering, is there enough research that's being done in this field? I noticed that you reference information, from 2004 and 1983, I believe. And I'm just curious, have we devoted enough research to this? Or enough resources to know the best path forward. So I guess I'm wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah, when I was doing my research, it was quite hard to find. I mean, there's a lot of research out there, but specifically about this topic, I expected that there wouldn't be a whole lot of research. I still think that the concept and the demands that I think that what I did find was really good. And I think as far as the research goes, yes, there is more research out there than what I talked about exactly, but yes, we need more research in that field. Right now, I'm not sure how much there is, but yes, we need more. And really, it's quite common. It's a quite common concept.
Okay. Well, I'm going to limit myself to one question, just based on the time. And Stephen, I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, Truc, I really enjoyed your presentation. There were several interesting points that we probably don't have time to talk more about. I liked the fact that you emphasized the variety in the backgrounds of the deaf students that, and I believe you're going to become a teacher yourself, the variety of the deaf students that you're going to encounter, and the fact that that variety means that you're going to need a variety of teaching methods. Quite how you do that in a classroom when you've got those students in the same class, in the same class period, that's always going to be a challenge. The one question that I'm going to ask you though is, you know, a lot of students, one student this morning, for example, did a project about which at the beginning they knew next to nothing. It wasn't their field. They just went into a completely new field to do their project. So they obviously learned a lot about a brand new field. However, in your case, as in with most students build their project on information and knowledge they already have, they just expand that out. You are like one of those students. You knew a lot, you had a lot of opinions about teaching deaf students. So what I'm going to ask you is, how different are your opinions now? Having done this project, what did you learn from it? How did it change your opinions about teaching deaf students?
Yeah, so actually, as you mentioned, I did kind of have some understanding about teaching, but I don't have full experience and I don't have full knowledge of what it's like to teach deaf students specifically. So yes, I did not have anything more in depth, but now that I've gone more in depth because of this research, I'm realizing how much diversity there is with deaf students. I knew we're not all the same, obviously, that not all deaf students are the same, but I didn't really have a full understanding of how much. And I thought that a lot of deaf people lack education. And I thought that I also didn't realize how much impact the background of the family would have on the deaf student. You know, what their home life is like, where they're from. I thought that was fairly standard across many deaf people, or that, oh, the families aren't going to teach them how to read lips or use their voice. So I was unaware of that level of responsibility on the family and where that environment is coming from. So it's also not just family, it's other things in their life that they experience. But when they come to school and they come somewhere else, I realized that, wow, there's just so much difference. People get so confused. And I think that actually helped me as I went more in depth through this research. And the reason I went more in depth was because I wanted to know more about this topic.
Okay, I really, just wrapping it up now, I really liked your idea of sitting down with the parents at the beginning of the year when you have a new class and figuring out exactly what their language, particularly their language background has been. But we can't stay with this topic anymore. We've got to go to Laura. So thank you very much, Truc. Great presentation. And I see that Dr. Kurz has been listening in and was your mentor. So thanks a lot, Dr. Kurz, for your mentorship. And now we're going to go to Laura. And so take it away, Laura.
Can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so for my capstone project, I researched and learned about 2 heart conditions, coronary artery disease and tetralogy of Fallot. So the scope of my project was to research and learn about these 2 conditions, and then to create illustrations depicting the human heart and the effects that these conditions have on its structure and function. And then to also provide written descriptions to accompany the illustrations. So before I get into describing the project, I'm just going to give a brief background about myself and why I chose this as my capstone. So my concentrations in SOIS are biomedical sciences and journalism. And each of these really speak to the diversity of my personal interests. So I really enjoy learning about the human body and also researching and gathering information. But I also have a more creative and artistic side, which is where the journalism concentration comes in. And that's more focused on the creativity, writing, and communicating information to others. So in completing my project, it challenged me to learn about 2 heart conditions and become familiar with their associated medical terminology, to synthesize, dissect, and simplify information, to apply my writing skills, and to also apply my creativity and my drawing skills by learning to visually communicate information through illustration. So the project I completed was basically broken down into 2 parts. The first was researching and gathering information. And this is where I consulted journal articles, literature reviews, original research articles, as well as encyclopedias, textbooks, and a medical dictionary. And then I moved on to part 2, which was actually creating the illustrations and the written descriptions. And this really required me to simplify the information, so reread over all of the information that I gathered and make sure that I understood it. And then using that information along with visual references to actually create the illustrations and the descriptions. So these are just some screenshots of the main visual reference that I used for my project. And these are actually from an online program that I was introduced to in my anatomy course that I took a few semesters ago. And this is called Anatomy and Physiology Revealed. And this was really very helpful for not only learning the anatomy, but also when it came time to creating the illustrations, just having that visual reference there to help me through that. And what's really great about this program is that you can peel back different layers of the dissected, whichever organ you're looking at. So in my case, I focus specifically on the heart. And you can peel back layers as if you are dissecting it yourself, and you can reveal some of the internal structures. And you also have the option to put labels there, read more about the structural information, and also just see how all the different structures are related. And there's also a 3D model of the heart in the program as well, which you can rotate and make certain structures visible or invisible, change the transparency, and see kind of how the structures are related to each other, which might be difficult to see just from the dissected images. So I definitely did find that helpful when it came time to creating illustrations. So the first condition that I looked at was coronary artery disease. And this is actually the most common heart disease in the US. The main feature for this is a buildup of plaque or atherosclerosis in the coronary arteries. And for both coronary artery disease and tetralogy of Fallot, I really needed to make sure that I had a solid understanding of normal heart anatomy and physiology before trying to understand how these conditions affected the heart. So for coronary artery disease, I needed to understand the role of the arteries and veins. So for like other muscles in the body, cardiac muscle requires oxygen and ATP for proper functioning. And the coronary arteries are the vessels that supply oxygenated blood to the heart muscle, while the coronary veins return deoxygenated blood from the heart muscle to pulmonary circulation after it's been used. And using this information is when I moved on to create my first 2 illustrations. So this first one is a frontal or anterior view of the coronary arteries and veins. And here I just put a screenshot of the program that I mentioned earlier. And as you can see, there's pins where you can hover over and see what the structure is called and see where it is in relation to other structures of the heart. So I really used this for making sure that I had all of the arteries and veins in the right spot, and also just to review the names and make sure that I had them correctly positioned in relation to each other. And the second illustration is also of the coronary arteries and veins, but from the posterior or the back view of the heart. And for both of these illustrations, I decided to go with the typical red and blue that you would usually see with illustrations of arteries and veins. And that's usually because they denote the association with either oxygenated blood, which is red, and that's associated with the arteries, or deoxygenated blood as blue for the veins. So as I mentioned earlier, atherosclerosis is the main feature of coronary artery disease. And this is what causes the arteries to narrow and block blood flow to the heart. And once you have a blockage of blood flow, you have a lack of oxygen to the heart's muscle cells. And the medical term for that is myocardial ischemia. And over time, if you have significant occlusion or blockage of an artery, it can cause a heart attack or myocardial infarction. So the next thing that I focused on for the illustrations is the actual formation of a plaque. So actually, before I even started my research, I was under the impression that a plaque is just a buildup of fat in the artery that kind of sits on the surface of the artery. But as I researched more about it, there's actually a lot more that goes into that. So in very simple terms, the way plaques form is they begin with endothelial injury, which is damage to the innermost lining of the artery. And that makes that lining more permeable and allows LDL or cholesterol to accumulate. And there's also a recruitment of inflammatory cells and smooth muscle movement towards the intima, which is the innermost layer of the artery. And then you have lipid deposition and the formation of a fibrous cap that makes the plaque stable. So these next two illustrations are showing a stable plaque in the artery and a ruptured plaque. So for the stable plaque, there's a fibrous cap that, as I mentioned, covers the surface of the plaque and makes it stable. And the core is composed of lipids, calcium, protein, and other cellular materials. And once you have a stable plaque, that causes an occlusion of the artery that blocks blood flow and leads to ischemia. And sometimes if the plaque is vulnerable, it can rupture and lead to the formation of a thrombus or a clot. And what happens is there's an exposure of the plaque core to the blood flow, which causes recruitment of platelets and inflammatory cells. And ultimately what happens is a platelet aggregation that leads to the development of a thrombus. And in both of these cases, they both block blood flow and lead to the ischemia, which is the lack of oxygen. So those were all the illustrations that I did for coronary artery disease. Now I'm going to talk about tetralogy of Fallot. This is actually one of the most common congenital heart diseases, meaning that it's present from birth. It accounts for 7 to 10% of all congenital cardiac malformations. It's frequently diagnosed during fetal life, and surgical correction is usually performed before 6 months of age. And that is usually just because they want to correct the malformations before they progress and cause greater damage to the patient. So there are 4 key features that define this condition. The first is a ventricular septal defect. So in a normally developed heart, the left and the right ventricles are separated by the ventricular septum, which is basically a muscular wall that separates the left ventricle and the oxygenated blood from the right ventricle and its deoxygenated blood. So with this defect, that wall is malformed, and as a result, the blood is shunted between the 2 ventricles, which allows that oxygenated and deoxygenated blood to mix. The second feature is very closely related to the septal defect, and that's the overriding aorta. And this is when the aorta arises from both the left and right ventricles instead of just from the left ventricle. And as a result, it receives both oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. The third feature is a right ventricular outflow tract obstruction. And this is essentially an obstruction to pulmonary blood flow, which increases pressure in the right ventricle and leads to hypoxemia, which is low concentration of oxygen in the blood. And last, the fourth feature is a right ventricular hypertrophy. And this is the thickening of muscle in the right ventricle that develops as a result of the outflow tract obstruction. And this is when the thickened muscle basically compensates for the obstruction caused by the outflow tract obstruction. And it's to help generate more pressure to force blood into the pulmonary trunk. So what I just described is a very simplified version of the information that I encountered during my research. And that's because several of the resources that I consulted used a lot of really complex terminology that I needed to break down, and simplify before I could even begin the illustrations. So here's just a passage from one of the research articles that I looked at. And as you can see, there's a lot of really dense medical terminology that I was very confused on at first and needed to break down to understand. So main definitions here are outlet septum, which is a muscle that separates the 2 ventricular outflow tracts, septoparietal trabeculations, which are bands of muscular tissue, subpulmonary infundibulum, which is a cone-like area in the right ventricle from which the pulmonary trunk arises. So after I kind of gathered an understanding of what the main terms are, I pieced everything back together and understood that this is essentially describing the outflow tract obstruction. And basically what it's saying is that the muscle that separates the left and right outflow tracts is deviated and contributes to the obstruction of the pulmonary trunk. So using that information and the definitions that I gathered for all 4 of these defects, I created my last 2 illustrations. The first one is VSD and overriding aorta together. And the reason why I paired these 2 for this illustration is because of the close relationship that they have with each other. So here you can see the ventricular septal defect and the overriding aorta. And basically what happens is the aorta is overriding the ventricular septal defect, and it receives oxygenated and deoxygenated blood from both of the ventricles. And this second illustration is the outflow tract obstruction and the right ventricular hypertrophy. So here I illustrated the deviated outlet septum that I mentioned earlier, and there's a thickening of the muscle in the right ventricle. So the outcomes of my project, I essentially learned to effectively search for and sift through information through journal articles, encyclopedias, textbooks, and other resources. I also used what I learned in my biomedical science courses to understand these 2 heart conditions. I also learned to simplify complex information and translate my findings into drawings and written descriptions. And lastly, I applied my creativity and my drawing skills towards creating illustrations that communicate the key aspects of coronary artery disease and tetralogy of Fallot. And that's it. Does anyone have questions?
Let me go first, Laura. So are you now going to become a cardiologist? It sounds like you're pretty much along the way there.
Yeah, it was definitely very interesting. I think my main focus was just trying to be able to research 2 things that I was somewhat familiar with. Tetralogy of Fallot was actually something that I'd never heard of before and wanted to learn more about. So yeah, the main focus was just to be able to research and learn more about it and then communicate it. So yeah, I definitely found it very interesting though.
I had one technical question. With atherosclerosis, you said the process begins with, and then I'm learning the terms, or at least I'm trying to remember the terms, begins with endothelial injury.
Right.
What would cause that?
So there's a lot of risk factors for that. And one of the main risk factors for atherosclerosis is a high level of LDL cholesterol, which is low density lipoproteins. And basically when there's, the blood flow is exposing the endothelium to these different particles, it causes the damage to that lining. And then it eventually leads it to either damage or it's abrasive to it. And then it causes it to become permeable, and that leads to the rest of the procedure that leads to the plaque formation.
So it's more of a mechanical than a biological cause of the injury.
Right, and I think it could be a mixture of factors, but that is just one of the ways that it can lead to that injury.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, I'm glad that you put at the end what all you've learned, because that is always going to be one of the questions that we like to ask, but you've already responded to that. So I thought it was a very, very, very thorough presentation of your work, and congratulations on being able to translate all those terms. You must feel a lot more competent in those areas now than you did to begin with. I mean, you've learned how to do that. I mean, most people when they read those sentences, I mean, what does that mean?
Right.
So I would imagine that that's been a big benefit for you. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Meg now.
Thanks, Stephen. So Laura, I really enjoyed that. I'm wondering just the level of research that you needed to do in order to make these sketches. I mean, not every medical student has your level of artistic ability, clearly. But I wonder, is there some value in actually having to sketch this out, you think, that would be worth you know, it's a level of investigation that I wonder would be valuable for medical students.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think a lot of people are very visual learners, and myself included. So even for people who are trying to learn about a new condition or some kind of procedure, having a visual there so that you can see, you know, what the words translate into in terms of structures and what they look like, I think that's definitely very helpful. So even if, you know, if someone, a medical student, doesn't have artistic ability, they might sketch something out just to understand how things are related to each other. And I definitely find that helpful for myself too, when I'm reading through information that has a lot of really difficult terms to understand, and it's explaining processes that are difficult to visualize just by reading the words. So
Yeah.
I agree with you. I think in learning the different approaches is invaluable. So my next question is, what's next for you? And is this particular, is the heart in particular something that's of real interest to you?
I think it is. I never considered it something like becoming a cardiologist. I never thought of about that before. But I think completing this project just showed my interest in wanting to communicate medical information and make it simpler, either through illustration or just through simplified written description. So I think I'd like to look for more ways to be able to do that professionally, either through medical communications or science writing or something along those lines.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I thought that was really, really interesting. Stephen, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, so we're past the hour, and so I'm going to wrap it up, and want to thank all three of you for doing fabulous presentations, and remind you, as I always do at this point in the session, that we will look forward to receiving your 2 papers in the next couple of weeks, and then you're done with, at least with your capstone. I think probably some of you are graduating, maybe all of you are graduating after this semester. So to the extent that that's true, we wish you great success in your time when you finally leave RIT. Hopefully, feeling fully educated. Although RIT always says that learning is for life. So I hope we manage to inculcate that principle. So thanks again, and lots of luck for the future.
Fantastic job, everybody. Stay safe, hang in there over these next couple of weeks. We're really proud of your efforts. And for those of you that are graduating, excuse me, an early congratulations. Great job.
Bye.
All right, thank you.
Thanks to the interpreters too.
Just a quick question. I was curious when you'll have our grades.
Not until the end of the semester.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.